Terminator 2 Judgement Day, or T2 for short, was written by James Cameron and one of his collaborators from the first film, William Wisher. Cameron would of course also direct the film. T2 is the sequel to The Terminator, which came out in 1984. In the movie, Arnold Schwarzenegger plays a cyborg that is sent back through time by an evil supercomputer. His mission is to kill Sarah Connor, a woman whose son John will turn out to be the savior of mankind. A protector for Sarah is also sent back in time, named Kyle Reese. In the end, Arnold's Terminator is destroyed and the future is saved, but Kyle Reese is killed in the process. There were a lot of challenges in creating the story for T2. Arnold was set to return, once more playing a T-800 Terminator sent back in time. But this unit having been reprogrammed to protect John Connor, now 10 years old. Question was, protect him from what? One of the major hurdles to overcome when creating the new story was to come up with a worthy opponent for Arnold. His portrayal of the evil Terminator has turned out to be iconic and arguably his most famous role even to this day. So how could you possibly top that? Time was ticking to come up with answers. One thing people might not realize when it comes to Terminator 2 is how incredibly fast this movie was written. The Terminator rights had been entangled in a legal web ever since 1984, but in the beginning of 1990 the producers at Carolco, Andrew Vanya and Mario Casar, wrote some pretty big checks, secured the rights, and suddenly the sequel was a go. The movie was set to be released in the summer of 1991, meaning it had to go from blank page to finished film in a year and a half. For comparison, a modern superhero movie takes about 3 years. How long does it usually take to write the screenplay for a 2-hour movie? It's an answer that varies a lot depending on the project and the amount of time available. But in general, I say writing a complete first draft, if you work normal work hours, takes about 6 months. At least that's my own experience, but writers work at very different paces. So how long did it take to produce a first draft of T2? About 7 weeks, which is insanely fast. Especially considering this screenplay would be the blueprint for what would turn out to be, at the time, the most expensive movie ever made. Cameron and Wisher worked more or less non-stop. It all came out of Cameron's original idea for a sequel, which was summarized as A Boy and His Terminator. So who would be the enemy of this particular story? Cameron and Wisher entertained the concept of a dual role for Arnold for quite a while. A good T-800 and a bad T-800. Problem was that these two opposing forces would have been absolutely equal in strength, speed and intelligence, making the evil Terminator much less threatening. Cameron explains that the idea also felt gimmicky, plus it would have meant that visually they had to do something to separate the good Terminator from the bad Terminator, meaning Arnold would have to have spent twice as much time in the makeup chair.
3 more hours of this. I don't know how much longer I can take this.
But what if they had cast another actor, physically bigger than him, maybe to play some sort of upgraded, even more fearsome variation of the T-800? Cameron explains that the idea of creating an even bigger Terminator was never really considered, as the Terminators at their core are supposed to be infiltrators. So if T2 would have featured someone even bigger than Arnold, it would probably have stretched the logic too much. Imagine, for example, actor/bodybuilder Lou Ferrigno playing some sort of upgraded T-800. Now Lou Ferrigno is awesome, but his Terminator wouldn't exactly have blended into a crowd. I mean, Arnold kind of gets away with it, but just about. So instead the filmmakers decided to go with a normal-sized actor to play the antagonist. At one point the idea of casting a female actor in the role was considered, but eventually scrapped. Although we'd see a evil female Terminator 12 years later in Terminator 3. So in the end, actor Robert Patrick was cast to play the new Terminator, a T-1000. Cameron explains that this particular Terminator was the only one of its kind in existence, and he wanted to support that idea by casting a basically unknown actor. Although it seems the original plan was to actually cast singer Billy Idol in the part, but Idol would not have been able to handle the physical challenges, as he had recently suffered a motorcycle accident. So this new evil Terminator would not be another hydraulic type of machine, but instead a prototype made out of liquid metal that could also shapeshift. The concept of a shapeshifting Terminator was also considered back in the original movie, but visual effects were not up to the task in 1984. The T-1000 is a really interesting character in many aspects. Of course, the visual effects were absolutely groundbreaking for its time, and amazingly still holds up all these years later. But I think the real strength of the character comes from the core concept, because it turns out to be liquid metal. It can't be stopped by blunt force. Gunfire will slow him down, but only temporarily. Special effects legend Stan Winston opposed the idea of a shapeshifter at one point, as he felt it really isn't a character. If it can turn into anything, like a lamppost or a chair, and is always turning into something new, there's really no consistency in the character. But eventually it was decided that this problem could be overcome by having the T-1000 always form back to one original character. And we should not forget what a brilliant move it was to have the T-1000 assume the shape of a police officer. I mean, what better way to infiltrate society, right? Just imagine if he wasn't a police officer and just walked around in civilian clothes and headed over to John's foster parents and asked for a picture of their son. They might have called the actual cops if that had happened. Coming up with the rules for the T-1000 was also a major challenge. It was decided that it could not fly, it could not become a car or a bomb, it could not alter its own chemical composition. It could imitate an object but not really turn into that actual object. And it could only imitate objects that was roughly the same size. It might seem like a lot of limitations, but from a scientific standpoint they actually make a lot of sense. And one thing it could create was knives and stabbing weapons, which was more than enough to create a formidable threat. So with the rules set in place, there was one more major hurdle to overcome. Just how do you go about killing a T-1000? If you blow it up, it would reform. If you blow it up over a large area, it would just take a bit longer to reform. It was finally decided that the only way to stop it would be to drop it into molten steel, something that would alter its molecular structure. So the setting of the steel mill, where the final battle takes place, was born out of necessity. One thing that was kicked around was that the T-1000 would be melted down and turned into a set of tools, but eventually it was decided that it would just fall into the vat of molten steel and just disintegrate. So there were a lot of decisions that had to be taken in order for the T-1000 to work as a character. All these years later, as we watch the movie, we sort of take it all for granted. It always impressed me how Cameron and Wisher made the rules of this particular Terminator so clear. I think very few audience members were confused about the abilities of the T-1000 back in 1991. So was the T-1000 a worthy opponent for Arnold's T-800? Of course, and I think very few people would argue otherwise. This thing just keeps coming and always performing and always looking perfect no matter the abuse it takes, while the T-800 gets more and more damaged. At one point the T-1000 gets frozen by liquid nitrogen, but manages to reform thanks to the heat from the steel mill. In the special edition of the film, the T-1000 starts glitching out as a consequence of being frozen, but it was decided that he would be even more threatening if he seemed totally unaffected by being frozen. So these glitching shots, which still looks amazing and probably cost a whole lot of money, were taken out of the film when it premiered back in 1991. There were also many other smaller storytelling decisions that increases the threat level. I'll mention two of them. As the T-800 and the T-1000 have their first confrontation in the service corridor of the Galleria, Arnold asked Jim Cameron if his Terminator could pick up the T-1000 and slam him against the floor, but Cameron vetoed it, saying the T-1000 was too dense. But I suspect his actual reasoning for it was that it would sort of devalue the threat of the T-1000 if it could be picked up and slammed against the floor. Come Terminator 3, there was actually a scene where the evil Terminator, named the TX, is being lifted up and slammed into the walls and a toilet bowl. Personally, I think this was a bit of a mistake and made a bit of a mockery of the TX. One other thing of note is when the T-800 confronts a SWAT team towards the ending of the movie. A part of his skin is blown off, revealing the endoskeleton underneath. Originally, more of the face would have been blown off, revealing more of the chrome and the glowing red eye, but it was decided it would increase the T-1000's threat level even more if he was the one that caused the majority of the damage to the T-800. So the final stage of Arnold's makeup, stage 567, was saved for later. And as a matter of practicality, it also saved Arnold a few hours in the makeup chair. Personally, I think the Terminator models peaked with the T-1000. Subsequent sequels tried to come up with all sorts of new and formidable models. Some carried built-in weapons, others could form into some sort of energy cloud, others could split in two. But somehow the simple idea of a liquid metal Terminator that just reformed after it was shot was so simple, yet so effective. Sometimes bigger isn't always better. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you again next time.